All right, guys, welcome back to class. I think in the last segment, we went across a couple of examples which, in a way, help us apply the different frameworks we discussed previous to that. Frameworks involving understanding the market structure, understanding asset specificity, understanding questions related to the dynamics of trade and how trade and investments play a role in influencing outcomes, particularly relating to foreign policy, especially circumstances that allow us to understand economic interdependence as an important factor, unlike what the realists would have ascribed. Economic interdependence does allow states to use possibly um, different tactics, different strategies, in a way averting maybe the direct use of armed conflict, military conflict, etc. Some of the examples that we discussed, for instance, um, contested sovereignty around Senkaku or the Tiaoyuthai Islands, and the fact that instances which were exacerbated uh, in the instance that Chinese fishermen at some point in time were arrested and possibly the issue of sovereignty was sort of amplified to the next level. The response was that particularly items that were integral to high-tech manufacturing in Japan, items like rare earth minerals, were disrupted, and eventually that particular tool um, did constrain the Japanese from taking that line of action forward in that particular direction, in the sense that Japanese companies, particularly automobile manufacturers, were able to press their government to relent, as it were. We also discussed the issue related to um, the South Korean court ruling on restitutions associated with forcible use of South Korean labor, and coming as it was after quite a long period of time compared to the occurrence, the Japanese um, tried and um, made sure that their exports of commodities like photoresist, like fluorinated polyimide and hydrogen fluoride, which are basically again important components in the semiconductor industry, were placed under some kind of export licensing requirements, which was basically some sort of a restriction. It's a euphemism for restriction. And eventually you had the South Korean government themselves paying the compensation that had to be paid. We also discussed more recent examples, um, particularly after the first round of tariff wars, something that continues from Trump 1, subsequently to President Biden's term, related to the exports of, again, commodities like photolithography scanners, ion implanters, and other manufacturing equipment. In a way, again, suggesting to us that economic tools can be a sufficient kind of deterrence in order to deal with a certain kind of behavior, right? And now we'll take the argument forward why I say a sufficient kind of deterrence for certain range of behavior is that there would be instances where states might actually decide to forego this sort of a temperate kind of a response. And of course, the last case that we also discussed, basically relating to important inputs again in the semiconductor industry, and particularly over graphite, which is a crucial component of lithium ion electric batteries. So taking our discussion forward, we had also outlined that when we look at economic interdependence, we definitely distinguish it from ordinary economic interaction. Even when we study economic interdependence, we need to remind ourselves that simply looking at high levels of economic activity alone may not signal interdependence. Reason being, if you have a situation where both parties are able to access new markets at home and abroad, in the event that there is some kind of disruption in trade, um, you really cannot say that simply having high levels of economic activity amounted to economic interdependence. At the same time, low levels of economic activity may mask the existence of interdependence that is driven by either monopoly or monopsony power. So, goes back to our previous discussion of frameworks like asset specificity and market structure. Again, the distinction that is made in point number 2, that interdependence is distinguished from interconnectedness. Basically, the example helps us understand how you sort of move along a gradient to a more intense kind of an interaction that qualifies as interdependent. So, if state A begins to trade with state B, and for instance, it starts importing oil, then you have some kind of interconnectedness emerging. If then state A begins to rely on that particular imported oil as its primary source to run its industrial economy, then clearly it develops some kind of dependency on state B. Now it becomes interesting when you go further along the gradient. If the oil exporting state B then becomes dependent either on the resulting cash flow, that is the money that it gets from selling that oil to state A, or any other good or service that state A might be providing, it is then that we are looking at some kind of interdependence to be emerging, right? So I think this clarifies conceptually the kind of situations we are looking at. In terms of definition, I think previously we had discussed the manifestation of sensitivity versus vulnerability. I think we had given the example of how instances in one economy, if they produce, some kind of volatility, produces some kind of inflation, you are aware that it creates some kind of sensitivity interdependence. It reflects some kind of sensitivity interdependence, and vulnerability being a more acute measure. Keohane and Nye formally discussed this in terms of definitions by suggesting that sensitivity refers to the immediacy and initial intensity of costs that another state can impose by altering the interdependent relationship, right? Sensitivity involves the acute reaction costs incurred by a state due to unexpected changes, right? So it's very clear. I mean, sensitivity possibly can be thought of as a much milder form, as maybe an initial kind of a phase before you move towards engendering some kind of vulnerability, when that relationship is sufficiently enmeshed, sufficiently costly for both states to break. So basically, you're looking at a certain kind of immediacy in reaction. That's why the example relating to volatility in one, maybe some kind of inflationary pressure in the other, was somewhat an easy way of understanding sensitivity, right? The initial intensity of costs that another state can impose by altering the interdependent relationship. Vulnerability, on the other hand, is defined by a state's ability to compensate and rebound from the costs incurred as a result of policy changes from another state. If a state is immediately and intensely affected by a hike in oil prices by its trading partner, we can say that the state is very sensitive to those changes. If, however, it is able to compensate quickly for the price hike by either seeking alternate sources of energy or alternate sources of oil suppliers, then the state is not vulnerable to such economic manipulation. I think the example is self-explanatory in the sense that if you have some kind of immediacy or an initial kind of reaction which involves the impact in state B from a certain action by state A, that conveys to us the level of sensitivity involved. And certainly if the action goes beyond just the initial impact and involves a major alteration of possibly either alternate sources of um, the particular product, or even alternate arrangements to deal with the particular discontinuation of that particular trade, then basically you are able to get a sense of how much state B is vulnerable to the actions of state A. Now, when we talk of these definitional categories, I think an intuitive question that comes to mind is how then would we operationalize this understanding of interdependence in some kind of a schema, right? And I think, all right, before we move towards operationalization of this, maybe there is some more clarifying definitional element which we can cover. Vulnerability costs therefore refer to the remaining costs that states face after they have adapted to the new situation to the best of their ability. Sensitivity interdependence, on the other hand, refers to the short-term adjustment costs that states make in response to foreign events under conditions of normal economic activity. So I think the definition is amply clear in the sense that there is an element of remaining in the relationship as far as sensitivity interdependence is concerned, and there is an element of breaking away from the relationship as far as vulnerability is concerned. So vulnerability cannot be operationalized simply by saying that, okay, there is this action that state A has taken, as a result of which goods in my country have become expensive. I mean, you might be sensitive to those changes. If you are able to adjust with those changes and then deal with the new situation accordingly, then you continue with the same relationship. But supposing the kind of action that is initiated by the first state implies completely drastic changes, wherein you no longer can sustain the same terms of dealing with the earlier state, and you have to make alternate arrangements, you have to find an alternate supplier, or you have to find an entirely new set of commodities in lieu of what earlier was being supplied, then that involves certain costs after breaking away from the existing relationship, right? So I think the degree, as we mentioned, in terms of a gradient, vulnerability conveys a more amplified gradient of interdependence, wherein you have the ability to understand what would be the remaining costs that states face after they have adapted to a new situation involving breakage of their existing ties, as opposed to sensitivity, which basically refers to maybe short-term adjustments under normal conditions of interaction. As such, sensitivity interdependence involves costs of being in an economic relationship with another country, whereas vulnerability interdependence refers to the costs of getting out of such a relationship. I think that's the point that we previously were making, right? And which brings me to the entire question of operationalizing this in some kind of a schema or some kind of a framework. So we are trying to understand economic interdependence. To what effect? To the effect that how is it that economic interdependence affects state behavior on questions of conflict, on questions of war and peace, right? That's what we are trying to understand. By virtue of certain definitions, we've understood economic interdependence to be qualitatively very different from how normal economic interaction is seen. Even when you have continual economic interaction, we've seen that there is a gradient in which bilateral economic ties can be situated. So you can be in a relationship with another country which is only sensitive to certain changes, But supposing you are totally dependent on another country for the chief supplies that actually drive your industrial growth, then certainly you are vulnerable, right? So the costs of remaining in the relationship and adjusting with business as usual kind of scenario, and the cost of finding alternate suppliers, finding alternate goods, that conveys a different gradient as far as economic interdependence is concerned. Now, coming to the question, how does one then begin to visualize some kind of a schema or some kind of a framework where interdependence affects state behavior in a certain manner? So there could be instances where sensitivity is the dominant aspect of a bilateral relationship. There could be instances where vulnerability is the dominant aspect of a bilateral relationship. How then does either of these conditions get reflected in the choices that states make vis-a-vis questions of war and peace? That is what we are trying to do when we sort of work our way through this schema or framework that we introduce. Now, some definitional categories that we should be clear when trying to understand this operationalization of interdependence. I think one is the idea of exit costs and exit cost threshold, right? I think just bear in mind these two frameworks. So I think intuitively it is clear that when you say threshold, threshold basically refers to what? Threshold is some kind of an upper limit, right? In simple terms, normally we would say that, you know, I've reached the threshold of my patience with X or Y, which basically conveys that I've reached an upper limit beyond which I'm not able to endure, right? Now, the threshold is up to the individual. In this particular example, the threshold is up to the individual. Now, if some students feel that they have a lower threshold in dealing with a particular professor, that might be their upper limit of, you know, I cannot deal with this particular person. Some students might feel that, well, I have a way around with dealing with a particular person. So just the idea of threshold as the upper limit, just keep that in mind. It is pretty much the same way that it also gets operationalized when we discuss interdependence between states. So exit cost threshold is the level of exit costs beyond which a player cannot endure the exit. Now, if I say, for example, just to give you a supplementary example, if I say that I'm going to reduce maybe the export, or I'm going to sort of introduce some kind of tariff, because tariff seems to be a more recent development, maybe is more relatable. If somebody says I'm going to introduce tariffs on a particular product category, now if that product category happens to be very important for the other state, it is very clear that their threshold is very high, the degree to which they can endure pain. So if somebody says I'm introducing a 2% tariff or a 4% tariff, states might put up with it. Again, depending on the fact that, you know, depending on the market structure, asset specificity, how important that particular product is. If somebody is exporting rare earths to another country and just wants to tweak their tariff by a few percentage points, rest assured that, you know, the other person will simply not, you know, call it a day as far as the bilateral ties are concerned, because they'll have a very high threshold for dealing with those kind of scenarios. There might be, as an alternate kind of scenario, there might be another situation wherein for another kind of commodity, a particular country might have a very low threshold of dealing with economic exit. So exit cost threshold is the level of exit costs beyond which a player cannot endure the exit. It sets a state's limit for the costs it is willing to bear in order to get or hold on to something that another state has or wants, right? So if I were to just say, for example, if we are looking at a scenario that involves a challenger and a particular target, now we are looking at the actual, sorry, Now we are looking at the actual operationalization of these frameworks. So what is it that we were trying to understand? One, an exit cost threshold is the level of exit cost beyond which a player cannot endure exit. So if this is the exit cost for the challenger and this is the exit cost for the target, if I were to have a notional line that conveys to me that for the challenger this is the level of pain that they can endure, anything beyond it goes over and above what they can endure. Somebody putting up a 2% tariff, it's not immediately that the other person will cave in or this thing. There is a degree to which you can deal with that scenario. Somebody putting up sanctions or some kind of blockade, right? It's not that suddenly the other guy's economy will collapse. There would be some kind of threshold up to which they will also bear with the pain, right? So every state does not automatically cave into any kind of demand. So in this particular example, if the challenger for his part faces, say for example, this can be the exit cost threshold of the challenger, and likewise we could have an exit cost threshold for the target, right? Now let's complete the definition first before we get into the operationalization. So exit cost threshold, we've understood, is the level of exit cost beyond which the state cannot endure exit. So in the case of the challenger, it is this particular limit beyond which they cannot endure exit. In the case of the target, it is this particular limit beyond which they cannot endure exit. This basically sets a state's limit for the costs it is willing to bear in order to get or hold on to something that another state has or wants. Exit cost threshold is again a function of three factors: the value of the demand being made by the challenger, the costs of escalating to militarized conflict. So the possibilities we have now moving into the schema are that depending on what is it that comes up between states. So between India and Nepal, there could be issues relating to border trade that comes up. Between India and Nepal, there could be issues relating to maybe the kind of maps that denote some contestation of sovereignty. So clearly when we discuss examples, we are also very clear that okay, different examples carry different weight as far as their reaction is concerned. For some issues, maybe the pressure point gets triggered much earlier. For other issues, states might be willing to, just see how much you are able to negotiate, how much you are able to discuss, right? I hope intuitively this is clear. That's how normally states would behave, right? The pressure point does not get triggered immediately the moment somebody says that I am introducing this kind of hike, say for example, in duties or tariffs, or for example, it concerns something more serious. So it becomes a factor of several aspects: the value of the demand which is made by the challenger, the costs of escalating into militarized conflict, and the probability that the challenger or target will be successful in that particular high level conflict. That's also very important, right? And it is not so difficult to understand that is the challenger some kind of a fixed role play? Is the target some kind of a fixed role play? Not necessarily. I mean, you might be a challenger in one particular instance, say involving China and the United States, when you want to bargain over access to technology and the other guy is not willing to relent, saying that you have a poor human rights record, etc., then you as a challenger might be wanting to invoke certain kind of actions. At another point in time, you might be at the receiving end because the other person wants to invoke certain other categories in return for something that they would be demanding, right? So in terms of role play also, it's not that the challenger's role is always fixed. That is why this framework becomes very interesting, because it can be applied to any bilateral, any dyadic situation which involves some question of bargaining, which involves some question of demands being placed. Do I resolve the lack of fulfilling that demand by using force? Maybe not so early. Maybe there is that threshold which I haven't reached. So I don't need to use war, I don't need to use conflict immediately just because, you know, my demands are not met. Demands are not met, right? So if this is the case, it becomes very interesting to see that the quadrant that we have here might actually be producing different kinds of equilibria for both the challenger and the target, right? So if I were to look at quadrant 1, any point in quadrant 1 basically involves what? Any point, say star, any point in quadrant 1 reflects a certain set of costs which are acceptable to the challenger. It's fairly evident because it's not yet reached his threshold, right? It's not yet reached the pressure point where he breaks down. Any point, the same point in quadrant 1 is also very conducive to the target because it's not yet reached the threshold for the target. Now, in such a scenario, any interaction that happens between the two states in quadrant 1 is likely to create maybe some kind of a conflict-like situation, right? Why? Because the economic interdependence is not sufficiently pressurizing both states into some kind of a painful kind of a scenario. Both of them can easily accommodate. One guy says that, you know, this is what I'm demanding. I want you to maybe modify whatever constitutional changes you are doing. The other guy says that, well, that is for me to decide, and we can put up with your sanctions, or we can put up with your restrictions for a certain period of time, and we can deal with it. So this is clearly a situation wherein the economic relationship has not been sufficiently weighty on both actors to produce maybe some kind of a bargaining that the challenger wanted. Now, if we allow ourselves to look at outcomes in quadrant 2 and say, for example, you choose another point in quadrant 2, what you see happening there is that for the challenger, anything in quadrant 2 represents scenarios wherein for them the cost is actually much lower than their threshold, whereas for the target has already exceeded that threshold. So in this kind of scenario, it is fairly reasonable to understand that the challenger can extract some kind of bargain from the target, right? Now the challenger and the target, like I mentioned, it could be anybody, and we'll get into the case studies that are actually reflective of these demands being placed and the kind of outcomes we get. But bear in mind that by virtue of being in quadrant 2, you are in a situation where, you know, just look at the axis which represents the exit costs for the challenger vis-a-vis their exit cost threshold, which is the vertical dotted line, and it becomes amply clear that the challenger doesn't feel that much pressure when they are invoking that particular demand. It could be any kind of demand, but they certainly have not reached their threshold. But for the target, it seems to have triggered a certain kind of pressure point because it has exceeded the costs that they can bear. So quadrant 2, if I were to sort of mention the word bargain, I think it's fairly believable that the challenger can extract some kind of bargain from the target. Quadrant 3, if you look at quadrant 3, it's fairly clear that for the target, any point in quadrant 3 represents costs which exceed the level of costs that they can bear, right? So any costs for the target are higher than their exit cost threshold. For the challenger, interestingly also, this is a serious kind of a trigger, because for them the costs are going over and above the costs that they can bear, their threshold. So in these kind of scenarios, again, when we go back to our previous discussion, in these kind of scenarios, usually because the challenger, by virtue of being the challenger, is trying to extract a demand, the outcome of that bargaining will depend on one of these factors, right? The value of the demand that is being made by the challenger. If, for example, that is something quite nominal for the target to accommodate, they would easily accommodate that bargain for the simple reason that they are already exceeding the exit cost threshold. If it is something which is not something of a nominal nature, but of something which is of an important nature, they would then put up with some kind of bargaining or some kind of contestation, right? Um, Again, the other factor, they would also factor in the costs that relate to escalating it to a militarized conflict. So even though both of them face costs which are much beyond their threshold, maybe the smaller state feels that if I give in to the demand, then I actually am able to avoid this kind of a military action, because the costs of getting into that militarized conflict is going to be high, and the probability that the challenger will win is pretty high, right? That much of assessment the states are able to make. So in any case, we find that in quadrant 3, again, different kinds of bargains are possible depending on the issue which is at hand, depending on again the probabilistic estimate of what is the likelihood of success, and also depending on the likelihood that it might derail into some kind of conflict. You can have some kind of a bargain plus kind of a scenario. It could be in either direction. The state can refuse if the weaker state or the target feels that they can resist despite feeling the pain. It could be a bargain plus kind of a scenario in that occasion. Quadrant 4, which is very interesting, because in quadrant 4, the challenger makes a demand despite knowing that my costs are beyond my tolerance, right? My costs have exceeded my exit cost threshold, and despite that, I still make a demand, which is not unbelievable. In international politics, you can have states of different sizes, of different capabilities, that might actually want to make certain kind of demands depending on the kind of scenario they are faced with, right? So if you look at now, if you ask me, are there examples to substantiate this? I mean, just look at the bargaining power that many Micronesian islands might have with their bigger neighbors, like Australia, for example. In terms of sheer costs that are involved, they might be facing exit costs which are much beyond what they can endure. But if they have to sort of negotiate something conditional on the fact that maybe we sort of develop closer ties with China, or maybe we require this or some other kind of demand, they are very well in the position to make that demand despite knowing fully well that the exit cost, the cost of removing themselves from that relationship, is much higher than their threshold. Despite that, they might actually be in a position to make that demand. Of course, it depends on the target whether they would want to sort of accept that kind of a scenario, but it's not an improbable kind of a scenario. So in quadrant 4, what you have is a situation where the challenger faces circumstances where their exit costs are much higher than what they can endure, but the target is in a very comfortable situation. The target faces exit costs which are much below their threshold. It has not reached the threshold. And in these circumstances, the framework beautifully tells us that such kind of demands never really work with the target, and it poses some kind of a constraint. So I think if we were to explain 3 equilibria from this framework, I think a constraint equilibrium emerges on the challenger, right? The challenger feels constrained. He knows that, if I do this, I might be in a situation where my exit costs go beyond my threshold, right? So even if it is a smaller Micronesian island wanting to do something, wanting to extract something, they may not be in a position to do that, right? The first quadrant is reflective of what is called as the escalation equilibrium, for obvious reasons. Why? Because both the actors, both the challenger and the target, do not really, and I'll just mention it there, both the challenger and the target do not really feel constrained by their bilateral economic relationship. I mean, of course, they might be having a bilateral economic relationship, but the cost of exiting that relationship is not painful for them because it hasn't reached their threshold. It's nowhere close to their threshold. So both of them, if they sort of initiate a demand, the other guy can very well refuse, because even for the other guy, the target, he's not in a situation where, it is exceeding his threshold. So he can also in a way resist, and most likely it is going to cause some kind of an escalation. Quadrant 2 and 3 give you a peek into different kinds of bargaining, right? Now, of course, it's not a static, fixed kind of bargaining that happens between states. Bargaining can happen by virtue of, what is suggested by the challenger in terms of what it demands from the target. So bargaining can happen in a manner wherein the target's exit costs are clearly higher than their threshold. So you look at 2018, and if you look at the first round of tariffs, it is fairly evident that the suddenness of the move, the suddenness of that particular move, in a way constrained the options that China had at that point in time, right? Of course, when you look at the second round of tariffs that are playing out currently after Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2, then you might say that it's a different kind of bargaining where the Chinese are trying to resist, right? Now, if somebody says 50% tariffs, 100% tariffs, they are willing to sort of stand up and say that no, it's not a question of something that we'll accept, possibly indicating that, the costs have been factored in, right? And for both parties now, given the fact that, it's been roughly 7 years that have passed, they've made some adjustments, and, they know that, this is the way they can deal with that scenario. So bargain kind of outcomes can be of different types. Quadrant 2 and 3 best exemplify the fact that, states are able to bargain depending on whether the challenger is constrained or the challenger and target both are constrained. But certainly quadrant 4 represents what is called as the constraint equilibrium, because in this particular scenario the target doesn't feel constrained by the cost of exiting that relationship. I think in terms of the formal definitions, if we look at the previous description, quadrant 1, neither state is sufficiently interdependent. So very clearly, when we talked about escalation in quadrant 1, because both of them were facing costs much lower than their endurance levels, quadrant 1, neither state is sufficiently interdependent. So what you find is there is no bargaining. Even if you try and extract something, the other guy is not willing to relent because his threshold is much higher. It's not that, at that point of bargaining, he suddenly has to cave in. And what you possibly find is the fact that there could be escalated conflict in quadrant 1. Quadrant 2 and 3, the definition again repeats the same logic. The target state is sufficiently interdependent, but not the challenger. So certainly in quadrant 2, the demand that the challenger makes, because it is well within his vertical threshold line, clearly the challenger is in a position to extract some kind of a bargain from the target. Quadrant 3, both states are sufficiently interdependent, and so what you can have is some kind of a limited conflict, right? You try and bargain, but again, depending on the issue at hand, depending on the cost of escalation to a military conflict, depending on probabilities of winning the war, you sort of can obtain outcomes. The author of this particular framework, a scholar called Mark Crescenzi, he says that in quadrant 2 and 3, the kind of bargaining that ensues between states can produce limited conflict, but not escalated all out kind of conflict. It will be some kind of a bargain that ultimately the states settle for. And quadrant 4 suggests that challenger is certainly um, interdependent, but the target doesn't feel the kind of costs basically overshooting their threshold. And in that particular scenario, the challenger is in no position to bargain with the target. Even if he demands something, the target would easily reject, and what you end up having is some kind of a status quo. I think we had described it as a constraint equilibrium. What is mentioned here as some kind of a status quo, right? Um, in terms of looking at case studies that might help us understand, one, the role play involved of being a challenger, of being a target, let me begin by quadrant 4. Um, let me take your mind to the 1980s. The context would be the apartheid era in South Africa. The challenger in this particular case would be the United States, and the target would be South Africa. What is the outcome that the challenger might have wanted to extract from the target? Very clearly, the US, being responsive to international pressure, and particularly completely justified in terms of the abhorrent practice of apartheid, the US wanted to apply economic pressure in order to make sure that the South Africans cave in to the particular demands that they were trying to make, particularly for the abolishment of the apartheid regime. Now, in this particular case, what did their bilateral trade look like? So for the US, again, we'll come to the definition subsequently. Let me first, the definition of each of those: constraint equilibrium, bargaining equilibrium, and escalation equilibrium. We'll come to that later. But in terms of the trade between both, imports and exports between the US and South Africa made up 20% of South Africa's total trade. And America's trade with South Africa was no more than 3% of what it traded with the rest of the world, right? So if you really think, I think the US could have used its economic might, and in one stroke, it could have made sure that 20% of South Africa's trade can simply be brought to a standstill, had it wanted to do so. What would have been the impact on the US? They would have lost only 3% of their trade, where the rest of their 97% of their trade with the rest of the world was secure. However, this particular bilateral relationship never played out in this manner. So intuitively we know that I could actually bring 1/5 of their economy to a standstill if I wanted to extract a particular demand from them. And I wouldn't lose as much because it's just 3% loss, and for a greater cause, like for example bringing to end the practice of apartheid, that was something that they could have dealt with. However, the interesting bit is that the United States never threatened to exit this relationship. And on that curious note, I'll bring today's discussion to a close, and more when we meet in the next class.